Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're opening up a really quite dark and frankly disturbing chapter of Roman history. We're looking at how absolute power didn't just corrupt, but how it actively, deliberately consumed the most vulnerable individuals, all to make a terrifying political point. We're diving into this unsettling story of how certain Roman emperors weaponized the bodies of castrated boys, eunuchs, turning mutilation itself into a symbol of, well, unchecked imperial power.
Yeah, it's a difficult topic, but absolutely crucial for understanding the extremes of Roman imperial authority.
We've got a pretty dense stack of sources to guide us here. We're looking at the big names, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, often quite scandalous in their accounts, but also Herodian, the later Historia Augusta, which has its own issues, but still.
A mix of contemporary and later views, each with their own biases, of course.
Right. And our goal, our mission for this deep dive, isn't just to list off horrific acts. We want to try and unpack the meaning behind it all. How did this pattern of cruelty develop? How did the violated body become this living symbol of an emperor's will to defy nature, law, Roman custom, everything?
And it's key to start with that central paradox, isn't it? Rome saw itself as the height of civilization, law, tradition. Publicly, Roman society condemned castration. They called it an Eastern corruption, something barbaric, foreign.
Yeah, completely alien to Roman values, supposedly.
Exactly. Yet these same Roman rulers, emperors, not only engaged in it, but in some cases flaunted it. The official disapproval just seemed to evaporate when the emperor wanted something.
So how did eunuchs even become a feature in Rome initially? Was it purely this imperial thing?
Well, no, not initially. Their introduction into elite Roman households, often influenced by Greek customs or imported from the East, was more pragmatic at first.
Yeah.
Think about it. These servants couldn't compete sexually with the master of the house. They couldn't produce heirs to challenge the family line.
Ah, I see. So they were seen as safe, pliable.
Precisely. Safe, pliable, malleable, non-threatening within that structure of family and dynastic power. But when all that power gets concentrated into one person, an emperor who starts seeing himself as, above the law, maybe even divine, that practical utility, it twists. It becomes a tool for performance, for domination, often terrifying domination.
And the first emperor who really grabbed that tool and turned it into this kind of high political theater, that was Nero, wasn't it? Which brings us to that infamous scene, that's so-called wedding in AD 67. We need to look at this not just as some act of, depraved passion, but as deliberate political theater.
Absolutely. Nero didn't just use a eunuch. He fundamentally redefined the purpose of that mutilated body. He did it through an act that struck at the very heart of Roman society, Roman marriage.
Okay, let's try and paint that picture. We're in the Palatine Palace. There's music, flutes playing, but it probably sounds strained, unnatural, right? Torches flickering.
Creating these long, dramatic shadows on the marble walls.
And the crowd, senators, courtiers, they're forced to watch. They're probably rigid with fear, maybe disgust, under this fancy gold canopy. And there, standing before Nero, is a young boy named Sporus.
A boy who, the sources like Suetonius and Dio tell us, Nero had forcibly castrated.
And then dressed him in a bridal veil, a flammeum, the traditional Roman bridal veil. It's this grotesque parody of a Roman wedding.
And the reason given, that Sporus bore a striking resemblance to Nero's late wife, Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea, who had died, let's not forget, under very suspicious circumstances, possibly involving Nero himself.
So Nero orders this mutilation. Why? Just the resemblance.
The sources suggest it was partly about preserving Sporus's youthfulness, the high voice, the smooth features, suspending him in this state of pre-manhood. It's like this dark, twisted attempt at resurrection, using a living child's body to defy death, to replace the wife he'd lost. But crucially, the act itself was illegal. Utterly illegal.
That's the point we really need to hammer home, isn't it? Roman law, the Lex Cornelia, specifically forbade the castration of freeborn youths. It was seen as an assault on Roman identity, on the father's authority, the patria potestas.
Exactly. So for Nero, the emperor, the ultimate source of law, to order this, it wasn't just a crime, it was a declaration. A declaration that he stood above all law, human or divine. His will was paramount.
And the physical reality of the procedure itself?
Oh, it would have been horrific. Roman surgery, especially for something like this,
Yeah.
likely a full emasculation, not just minor surgery. We're talking crude tools, no antiseptics, no understanding of infection control.
The risk of death must have been enormous. Shock, blood loss, infection.
Absolutely huge. The fact Sporus even survived is in itself remarkable. But surviving meant being condemned to this life as a living prop for Nero's desires and political statements.
So the wedding itself is the public performance, the so what, as you said.
Yes, it's Nero performing absolute sovereignty. He takes Sporus on tour through Greece, treating him with the honors of an empress, calls him Sabina,
Yeah.
carries him in an imperial litter, covered in jewels.
Forcing the Roman elite, who privately despise castration, to publicly acknowledge this creation, to bow before this boy who represented the emperor's power to literally remake reality.
If the emperor says this boy is now a woman, his wife, then the Senate, the army, everyone has to accept it. That's the terrifying message.
Yeah.
Total, unrestricted power over bodies, identity, reality itself.
Now, we should acknowledge the sources. Dio, Suetonius, they weren't exactly fans of Nero. Could they be exaggerating?
Oh, undoubtedly. They often sensationalize his actions for political or dramatic effect. That's standard for Roman historiography. But the core event, the castration, the public wedding, the parading of Sporus as Sabina, that seems pretty well attested across sources. It fits Nero's pattern of pushing boundaries, of theatrical defiance. It sent that clear message to his enemies. Your traditions, your laws, even biology, mean nothing compared to my will.
And what happens when that power finally collapses? Nero dies in AD 68. But Sporus is still alive. His story doesn't end there.
No, tragically it doesn't. Sporus basically becomes imperial property, passed down. Otho, the very next emperor, takes him almost immediately as a companion, continuing that strange intimacy.
But then comes Vitellius.
Ah, Vitellius. He apparently planned the ultimate degradation. According to the sources, Vitellius threatened to force Sporus onto a public stage, in a theater. The plan was to make him reenact the mythical rape of Persephone, to publicly perform his own violation and victimhood for the entertainment of the Roman mob.
That's just beyond cruel, calculated humiliation.
It was the breaking point. Sporus, who'd survived the knife, the trauma, Nero's court, the mockery. He couldn't face that. Rather than endure that final public stripping of dignity, he chose suicide. Opened his own veins.
His death is this haunting indictment, isn't it? He survived the physical act, but not the system. Not Rome's endless appetite for cruelty and spectacle, as you put it.
Exactly. And Sporus' tragedy, born from Nero's bizarre performance of love and resurrection, it sets this grim precedent. It opens a door. Later emperors would walk through that door, taking the possibility Nero demonstrated and, well, normalizing it, shifting its purpose from twisted fantasy towards systematic terror.
Which brings us neatly to our second section, normalization through terror. And the emperor who really embodies this shift is Domitian, ruled AD 81 to 96, a couple of decades after Nero.
Right, and the whole atmosphere changes. If Nero was chaotic theater, Domitian is cold, calculated paranoia, a climate of fear.
His public image was totally different from Nero's too, wasn't it?
Completely the opposite. Domitian cultivated this stern, disciplined, almost divine persona. He styled himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, Jupiter reborn, essentially. He created this court where senators were afraid to speak, where servants trembled. But that control was built on the same foundation of absolute power, just expressed differently, more quietly perhaps, but maybe even more insidiously.
So how did he use eunuchs? Not as a replacement wife like Nero did with Sporus.
No. Domitian used castrated boys primarily as silent attendants, and, importantly, as instruments of psychological fear. He surrounded himself with them. Their very presence in the palace was a constant, quiet reminder to everyone, I can do this. I have the power to unmake a man at will. And your status, your family, offers no protection.
That brings us to that chilling story, the banquet scene Cassius Dio describes. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, it's a classic example of Domitian's terror tactics. Imagine he invites senators to a feast. Sounds normal, maybe even an honor. But when they arrive, the room is set up like a funeral. The couches are gilded, sure, but the table, the plates, they're all black marble. The lighting is deliberately dimmed, flickering like tomb lamps.
Eerie, unsettling from the start.
Very. And then the attendants start moving through the shadows. Young boys, unnaturally smooth faces, pale skin, unbroken voices. They move silently, serving wine, bringing dishes.
Like ghosts.
Exactly like ghosts. They don't speak. Their silence, their altered state, is the message. It's a living declaration of the emperor's power to strip away not just freedom or life, but masculinity itself, the core of Roman identity for these elite men. It's psychological warfare, the unspoken fear hanging in the air is, who is this boy serving me? Is he someone seized recently? Could he be? Could he be the son of someone I know, taken from a noble house, mutilated by imperial order?
That potential violation of the noble household, the domus, that must have been terrifying for the elite. Taking a son.
That struck right at the heart of Patria Potestas, the father's power. Dio claims Domitian's circulated stories may be true, may be rumor, it almost doesn't matter, of boys being seized from aristocratic families, altered, and then returned to serve in the palace. These boys become living omens, physical proof that imperial desire could breach the most sacred boundaries. If the emperor can take your son and unmake him, what can't he do?
And this contempt for tradition, for the mos maiorum, the ways of the ancestors, it wasn't hidden.
Not at all. Domitian flaunted it, using the bodies of these children. Remember, mos maiorum emphasized lineage, military virtue, family continuity. Castration was the ultimate symbol of rejecting all of that.
And he even turned it into some kind of sick entertainment.
Yes, the mock battles. Suetonius mentions these spectacles at Domitian's villa on Lake Albanus. Not real gladiator contests, but grotesque parodies. He'd force dwarfs and eunuchs to fight each other, sometimes with blunted weapons. It wasn't about skill or bravery. It was about transforming their suffering and vulnerability into absurd, humiliating entertainment for him and his court, a demonstration of ultimate degradation.
What strikes me here is the institutionalization. You mentioned this earlier. Under Domitian, they weren't just occasional props.
Exactly. They became embedded in the palace machinery. These eunuchs, often called cubicularii or chamberlains, started controlling access to the emperor. If you wanted an audience, if you wanted to petition Lord and God, you had to go through them. They filtered information, managed secrets. This gave them immense practical power behind the scenes, even while they remained socially ostracized figures.
And yet, their own voices, their stories, completely lost to us.
Utterly silent in the historical record. They are reduced entirely to objects, instruments of fear, or administration. Historians only mention them as shadows, tools of the emperor. Domitian essentially took Nero's theatrical spark and systematized it. He normalized castration as part of the imperial toolkit, using the mutilated body to enforce state authority and psychological control.
Okay, so from Nero's spectacle to Domitian's systemic terror, where does it go next? The cruelty gets normalized, but then it seems to accelerate again, right? Into just pure degradation as entertainment.
Right, and that brings us to Commodus, ruling AD 180 to 192, almost a century after Domitian, and a whole different kind of horror.
Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor. Talk about a contrast.
The ultimate contrast. Marcus Aurelius represented stoic duty, restraint, reason. Commodus, well, he embodied the exact opposite. Absolute self-indulgence. He basically treated the entire Roman Empire as his personal playground, his stage. The palace became his private amphitheater. If Domitian used eunuchs for fear, Commodus used them, essentially, as toys for his own debauched amusement, and to humiliate the elite forced to watch.
Cassius Dio seems particularly disgusted by Commodus. He lived through it, served under him.
Yes, Dio's account is filled with personal revulsion. He reports that Commodus maintained entire troops of mutilated boys and men, not just a few attendants, but large numbers, and they were constantly forced into his games, made to fight animals in the arena, which is just horrifying to imagine or perform in these obscene parodies of myths, often dressed in ways that mock their condition.
Was there a specific pattern to the humiliation, like with Domitian's Black Banquet?
There was. One particularly grotesque example is Commodus's obsession with the Ganymede motif. Ganymede, the beautiful Trojan boy abducted by Zeus in eagle form to be his cupbearer on Olympus.
Right, a classic myth.
Commodus would frequently dress up a specific eunuch boy as Ganymede. Then, in front of the entire court, he would stage these explicit, degrading embraces and simulated sexual acts with the boy.
The symbolism there is pretty blatant.
Extremely. Commodus is casting himself as Zeus, the king of the gods, entitled to take, possess, violate anyone he pleases. The eunuch, physically altered, symbolically feminized, becomes the living proof of the emperor's untouchable, godlike status, operating completely outside human norms.
So, unlike Domitian, who maybe kept the horror somewhat behind closed doors or used it subtly, Commodus put it right out there.
Exactly. He displayed the mutilation openly. It wasn't just a symbol of fear. It was the entertainment. The altered state was part of the degrading spectacle. The Historia Augusta, again, sometimes sensational, but it captures the vibe, mentions Commodus lining palace corridors with castrated youth dressed as women, and then forcing senators and officials to walk through this human corridor like passing through a perverse gallery or even a brothel.
Degrading the boys to degrade the senator.
Precisely. Stripping everyone of their dignity. It highlighted this massive contradiction. The Roman elite, who supposedly despised castration as barbaric, were forced to stand there, watch this, maybe even applaud.
That must have just eaten away at their sense of Roman identity, their belief in the system.
Absolutely. Compulsory applause for acts you find repellent. It showed that power was absolute, unchecked, and frankly, terrifyingly whimsical. If the emperor could do this for fun, what couldn't he do? massacres, prescriptions. It all seemed possible.
Commodus's reign, predictably, ended violently, strangled in his bath, AD 192. But somehow, unbelievably, the cycle wasn't over. The peak, or perhaps the nadir, was still to come.
Yes, the cruelty reached its most, well, fanatical extreme just a few decades later, under Elagabalus. And this time, the driving force shifted again from personal pleasure or fear or parody to religion, sacred, state-sanctioned religion.
Elagabalus. Okay, this is where it gets really wild. Even by Roman emperor standards. He wasn't even Roman originally.
Born in Syria around AD 204, came to the throne incredibly young, maybe 14 years old, in AD 218. And crucially, he was raised as the hereditary high priest of the local sun god, Elagabal. This god was worshipped in the form of a black, conical meteorite stone.
So he arrives in Rome not just as emperor, but as high priest of a foreign god.
Exactly, and that's the key difference. Nero used castration for, let's say, twisted love, Domitian for fear, Commodus for grotesque parody. Elagabalus used it as a religious act. He tried to make castration a central part of sacrifice and consecration within his imported cult, demanding Rome abandon Jupiter and embrace his Syrian sun god.
That must have been an unbelievable shock to the system for traditional Romans.
A massive shock. A religious earthquake. Herodian describes the scene. Elagabalus enters Rome parading this black stone through the streets, and following him is this huge entourage of priests and attendants, including many conspicuously mutilated youths. These boys weren't just servants, they were elevated into sacred roles within his new state religion, dressed in gold, chanting in foreign languages. To conservative Romans, it felt like the East had literally invaded and swallowed the eternal city, spiritually speaking.
What was the religious precedent here? Was this just Elagabalus's invention?
Not entirely. He seems to have been modeling his court and rituals partly in the existing cult of the great mother goddess Cybele, whose priests, the Galli, practiced ritual self-castration. The Gallis were generally viewed with a mixture of awe and disgust in Rome, definitely social outcasts. Elagabalus didn't just tolerate figures like that. He tried to install that kind of ritualistic androgynous priesthood right at the heart of Roman state religion.
So what did these ceremonies look like? The sources must have been horrified.
The hostile sources like Dio and the Historia Augusta paint a lurid picture. Imagine the temple, draped in crimson fabrics, thick smoke from exotic incense, the constant thrumming of drums and pipes. And within this scene, mutilated boys, maybe some recently seized, others long consecrated to the god, moving in trance-like states, possibly involving bloodletting or other acts of devotion to the sun god. This fusion of, well, religious ecstasy and physical violation was profoundly disturbing to Roman sensibilities.
And it got even more extreme. There are stories about Elagabalus himself.
Yes. The most shocking claim, found in the Historia Augusta, is that Elagabalus, wanting to fully embody the priesthood of his god, the androgynous ideal, actually considered castrating himself.
Seriously, the emperor himself.
That's the claim. Now, whether he seriously intended it or not, we can't know. But he certainly inflicted the rite on others, reportedly demanding it as proof of loyalty to his new religious order. The very idea that the emperor might self-mutilate to serve a foreign god, that signaled to the Roman elite that all traditional boundaries, all Roman religious norms were simply gone.
And he even echoed Nero staging a wedding.
He did. Deliberately, it seems. He also married a male youth. Some sources say a charioteer named Hierocles. Others mention different figures dressing him in bridal clothes, just like Nero did with Sporus. But here's the crucial shift. Nero's wedding was a scandal, an act of personal megalomania that defied Roman norms. Elagabalus tried to make his act dogma. The mutilated boy wasn't just a symbol of imperial whim. He was presented as a living sacrament within this new religion, demanding reverence. It was a direct challenge to the identity of Rome itself.
This had to be the breaking point, right? You can push the Roman elite only so far.
It absolutely was. The Senate, the military, especially the Praetorian Guard, they could stomach a lot. They tolerated Nero's excesses, Domitian's terror, Commodus's debauchery. But overthrowing Jupiter, replacing Roman traditions with Syrian rituals involving mutilated boys as priests, that was too much.
So the system finally snapped back.
Violently. In AD 222, the Praetorian Guard mutinied, fueled by disgust, but also clear political calculation. They hunted Elagabalus down. He was dragged through the streets, his own body mutilated, defiled, and finally thrown into the Tiber River like common refuse. Even the eunuch attendants who, sources say, tried bravely to shield him were cut down alongside him. The knife that Elagabalus wielded so freely in the name of his god was ultimately turned against him, destroying him in his attempt to remake Rome's religious world.
So if we just pause and connect these dots, Nero, Domitian, Commodus, Elagabalus, it's like four distinct faces of the same nightmare, isn't it? Each using the violation of these boys for a different but equally absolute assertion of imperial will.
That's a great way to put it. You have Nero, defiance, twisted love, maybe resurrection, admission, systemic fear, control, intimidation, Commodus, degradation as parody, humiliation of the elite, and Elagabalus, religious fanaticism overthrowing tradition itself.
But in every single case, the mutilated boy serves as the living proof that the emperor stands above everything. Nature, law, custom, even the gods, apparently.
Exactly. The emperor's will is the ultimate reality. And what's fascinating is, if you look slightly earlier, you see a related dynamic, even when the physical act of castration isn't present.
You mean Hadrian and Antinosus?
Precisely. Nearly a century before Elagabalus, Antinous was Hadrian's beloved companion, beautiful youth, deeply adored. Crucially, he was not castrated.
Right.
But when Antinous tragically drowned in the Nile, Hadrian's reaction was extreme, immediate, empire-wide deification. Temples built, statues erected everywhere, cities founded in his name. A new god declared.
So even without the mutilation?
Even without the mutilation, you see the same fundamental imperial impulse. The emperor claims absolute ownership over the boy's life, death, and body, transforming him into a symbol, in this case, an idealized, beautiful god. Antinous the god, and Sporus, the mutilated bride. They represent opposite ends of the spectrum, perhaps, of imperial projection, one idealized, one degraded. But both are fundamentally defined and shaped by the emperor's fantasy and power. They are imperial property.
And this cruelty, this whole practice, it didn't just stay locked away in the palace, did it? It seeped out into society.
No, it definitely had echoes elsewhere. It started to normalize in disturbing ways. For example, you start seeing mentions of gladiatorial schools featuring mutilated fighters.
Why?
For novelty.
Purely for novelty, it seems. To shock a jaded audience, putting these physically altered individuals, often with high-pitched voices, into the hyper-masculine context of the arena, it was meant as a bizarre spectacle. Another sign of how imperial tastes could warp even core Roman institutions.
And we see it in literature, too.
Yes, the poet Martial, writing under Domitian, includes these sharp, satirical epigrams. He mocks wealthy Romans who dote on their eunuch slaves, calling them figures who are neither man nor woman. The fact that he could make that joke and people would get it tells you the presence of eunuchs in elite households, often as status symbols imitating imperial fashion, was becoming noticeable. A sign of wealth, access to these exotic imports the emperor himself favored.
But the real long-term legacy, the big irony, is in how the state itself came to depend on them.
That is the ultimate profound irony. Rome, the society that officially condemned castration, that called it barbaric, actually became structurally reliant on eunuchs to function.
How so? When did this happen?
It really takes hold in the later empire. By the time you get to Diocletian, who reorganized the empire, and especially Constantine and the establishment of Constantinople, the imperial court bureaucracy is heavily staffed and in many ways run by eunuchs.
So they went from being objects of scandal or fear to essential administrators.
Absolutely essential. The cubiculari, the chamberlains, became incredibly powerful figures. Historians from the period, like Ammianus Marcellinus in the 4th century, complain constantly about their influence. These eunuchs controlled access to the emperor, they often managed the imperial treasury, they were involved in policy decisions, appointments, everything.
Why them specifically? What was the advantage?
The perception, right or wrong, was one of absolute loyalty. Because they couldn't have families, couldn't found dynasties, their loyalty was seen as being solely to the emperor and the imperial house. They had no competing agenda, theoretically. So the very thing that made them safe servants in early households became the reason they were trusted with the deepest secrets and levers of state power in the late empire. The body mutilated for Nero's fantasy became the template for a key part of the imperial system, a system that would continue for centuries in Byzantium.
It's just incredible. An unbroken line, really, from Sporus' scream, maybe, to the silent power of these eunuch ministers running the empire from Constantinople.
It is. The emperors believed, it seems, that by unmaking these boys, they could remake reality, bending biology, law, religion, everything to their will.
As we wrap up this deep dive, the thing that really stays with me is what you mentioned earlier, the silence of the victims themselves.
It's the most profound absence, isn't it? Their individual stories, their feelings, their experiences, almost entirely lost. We know them only as these shadows, these symbols used by others. Sporus is the rare exception, and only because his humiliation was so public, so useful for historians wanting to condemn Nero.
Are there any other traces? Archaeology, perhaps?
There are faint whispers, Skeletons sometimes found in Roman-era burials, particularly in some catacomb contexts, that show skeletal markers, pelvic changes, bone density issues consistent with prepubertal castration. It's quiet, anonymous testimony etched in bone. But we also have to acknowledge the resistance that was recorded. The disgust in Dio's writing is palpable. The later Christian writers, like Tertullian or Lactantius, seized on these stories.
To condemn Rome's decadence.
Exactly. They used the examples of Sporus, of Elagabalus's rites, as proof of pagan Rome's moral corruption. Whatever their own agenda, their condemnation helped ensure that this reality that the knife was a tool of imperial power wasn't entirely erased from history.
So bringing this back to us, to the listener today, what's the takeaway? Is this just ancient horror, or is there something more?
Oh, I think it's far more than just ancient history. History is always a warning, isn't it? The specific justifications the emperors used, lust, fear, art, religion, whatever, they're almost irrelevant at the end of the day.
The core lesson is about power.
It's about what happens when power becomes absolute and unaccountable. When the institutions that should protect people are twisted to serve the powerful, and crucially, when the vulnerable are made voiceless. In that environment, cruelty doesn't just happen. It can become spectacle. It gets normalized. And we should never fool ourselves into thinking that kind of systemic exploitation is safely locked away in the past.
So the challenge is vigilance.
Vigilance is imperative. The emperor's specific appetite might be gone, but the underlying drive for control, the potential for exploitation that adapts, it finds new forms, hides behind new institutions, new justifications. The stories of Nero, Domitian, Commodus, Elagabalus, even filtered through biased sources. They're a stark reminder of how easily innocence can be targeted, how easily humanity can be stripped away when a society allows power to go unchecked, when people collectively look away.
It forces you to think about where those dynamics might play out today, even if the specifics look very different.
Absolutely. Sharpen your awareness. That's the lesson. The shadows cast by the Palatine are long. They challenge us to recognize where those patterns of power, silence, and exploitation might be manifesting right now in our own world.
A powerful and frankly chilling thought to end on. Thank you for walking us through this incredibly difficult but important history.
Thank you. It's crucial to remember these stories, however uncomfortable. Until next time.